Welcome everyone. I see folks are joining. We'll wait about 30 seconds or so before we start off this afternoon's session. So thanks for being here. Well, I wanted to welcome everyone. We'll go ahead and get started this afternoon. Glad you were able to take some time to join us in our 7th Launch Nebraska webinar. It's hard to believe. This is number 7. We have 10 scheduled. We have 2 more next week and then 1 the following week, and so hope you're able to join those as well. Today we're going to talk more about supporting all students, and this week focusing on how we support English learners not only through summer but as we think about towards the fall as well. So glad you were able to be here and looking forward to today's session. I wanted to start off our session today with just kind of a short reflection of the things that have been happening in our society over the past several weeks. I did want to make sure that you all were aware that Commissioner Blumstedt has put out a statement on racial inequities. And I mentioned this on Tuesday's webinar, but I again wanted to highlight the NDE's commitment to continuing to elevate the conversation around racial inequities. And I appreciate the Commissioner's comments, and I put a quote there on the screen that, you know, over the last couple of years, we've really highlighted equity, but certainly the events of the last several weeks have just highlighted the need to move from what we might say are aspirational messages around equity to more specific actions to identify and confront the inequities that exist in our educational system. So we put the link to the chat, or excuse me, there's a link to the document in the chat box. If you haven't had a chance to see it, hopefully it again identifies some commitments as we move forward, and which are certainly so much related to today's conversation as well. So I wanted to make sure everyone was aware. As we look back to Tuesday, I also just wanted to let folks know that the webinar from Tuesday, supporting students with disabilities, the recordings, which includes the slides, the tools, and the templates, are archived on our Launch Nebraska site. The guidance is there. I also just wanted to mention, in case you haven't heard, I know we have some folks that may not have joined us before, there's additional resources on Launch Nebraska specifically around health guidance for summer learning. There's guidance for summer school and summer learning, as well as specific guidance for students with disabilities. If you haven't checked that out, be sure to do so. LaunchNE.com, they're on the main page there. We'll continue to build out the resources associated with Launch over the next several weeks as we really start to think about building up our plans for fall. As just a quick reminder, this is, like I mentioned, our 7th webinar in a series of 10, really to provide clear and actionable information for districts and school systems that are aligned with continuity of learning plans. And our goal with this was really to start with summer learning, but then also shift to thinking about the school year. And I will say overall, we've gotten really positive feedback on the sessions. I love that they're archived, so click on the link and share them with your staff or your faculty or those that have missed. And also have just really appreciated the partnership with SchoolKit. They are no stranger to Nebraska. They've been in the state doing work for a couple of years now and providing support for not only our efforts around strengthening the core, but MTSS as well. So they're going to lead us through today's session. So I'm going to kick it over to Megan as we dive right in today.
Great. Thank you so much, Corey. Hi, everyone. As Corey said, my name is Megan. I am an assistant professor at Relay Graduate School of Education, but really to understand my background, I am a former Spanish, ESOL, World Studies, Math, and Italian teacher, kind of filled in wherever was necessary, but my primary focus was always English as a second language. I also have served as a school level administrator and a district leader of language acquisition. I am coming to you from Fairfax, Virginia, which is a suburb right outside of Washington, DC. And as most people who have just gotten married do, I got married in December. And so at the moment, I'm enjoying spending time with my new husband and our pets. But super excited for this time with you as well. And before we get started, I want to just remind us of our session norms. So first, if you have any questions, including tech, logistical questions during the course of the session, please go ahead and use the Q&A feature. And that's at the bottom of your screen, sort of toward the center of your Zoom window. It's a little bit different from the chat feature, and we'll be explaining in just a moment how we'll be using that. Second, I recommend that you exit full screen mode because throughout the session, we're going to actually be sharing different materials for you to access, and it's much easier to do that if you're not in full screen. And to do that, if you look at the top right hand of your screen, you'll see a little option that says full screen that you can exit from there. So take a moment and just exit full screen now so that you're able to access everything. And then our final norm, which is just important to keep in mind, is that all of this information, the recorded session and the PowerPoint deck, will be available at launchne.com along with the other documents and sessions that you've seen. So let's talk a bit about one other feature. So in addition to the other features, we'll ask you to use the chat feature a few times throughout the webinar. And we'll do that when we're looking for whole group shares on topics. And so that'll allow me to just see your thinking throughout the course of our time together. And I want to dive in by really thinking about why this is so important. So the NWEA has published some predictions of learning loss due to school closures this spring, which was shared in webinar number 1. And if you remember, they predicted unfinished learning of 30% in ELA and of 50% in math. And I want us to think about, if this is the regression for our typically functioning students in general education, what will the numbers be for our English learners who may experience even greater challenges? And from that, we also know just inherently that all students need and deserve consistent access to grade level content. And students who are starting the year below grade level benefit the most from on grade level instruction. And finally, that high quality instructional materials are really a key lever for ensuring students are engaging with grade level content. And to that end, our focus for today's session is on the screen. Take a moment to read it to yourselves. And it's really important to note that the practices that we're discussing today will be framed for remote learning because that is kind of the current reality that we're navigating. But these are really best practices for instruction for English learners, regardless of location of learning. So remote or in person, these can be easily applied to that work. And when we think about supporting English language learners, or ELs, you may immediately think of the Nebraska English Language Proficiency Standards. And those are designed not only to support students' English language development, they are also designed to ensure access to rigorous grade level content. And the 10 ELP standards are designed for collaborative use by English as a second language or English language development teachers and content area teachers in both English language development and in content area instruction. And this is really important because it highlights that language acquisition takes place across content areas. It's not only happening in one place. And therefore, it's really going to require collaboration among all educators who are supporting ELs. While there may be additional and specific supports that an EL teacher will implement to really address the varying levels of English language proficiency, it's also incredibly important that they are working with general education teachers to ensure that students have access to grade level content with a tier 1 curriculum. And that's where we'll be focusing our time and attention today. And it's really important to note, and as a former ESL teacher, it's something that always stands out to me. We could have an entire session that is focused on each of these standards and what supports might look like, for instance, to support a level 2 EL in making progress toward level 3. And that would be super worthwhile, but that's not the purpose of this specific webinar. What we are doing today is incredibly important, and we are focusing very specifically on increasing EL's access to grade level core instruction. And so with that in mind, let's take a look at the 3 guiding principles that will guide our learning today and our recommended approach for supporting ELs and accessing grade level tier 1 instruction. So the first one is that scaffolds and supports must be in service of helping ELs access grade level content. Second, we want to make sure that we are providing authentic and frequent opportunities for students to collaborate and share ideas with their peers. And finally, we want to make sure that we are amplifying, not simplifying language. A theme that you're going to hear throughout today's session is that everything we share, beginning with these 3 principles, is relevant for supporting ELs, regardless of whether instruction is happening in person or whether it's happening virtually, as is the plan this summer. And that being said, I also want to acknowledge that, and we will acknowledge that sometimes things might look a little different or might need to look a little different in a virtual setting. So for instance, you might be looking at these guiding principles and thinking to yourselves, how can I ensure students are able to collaborate with one another and share their ideas with peers? This is a great example of something that we know needs to continue regardless of whether students are in person or engaging in learning remotely. And it's such a critical aspect of supporting our ELs and accessing grade level content. While a virtual setting will of course present some interesting and unique challenges to doing this, we really have to prioritize it. So let's look at how we're going to go through this today. Take a moment to review how we'll spend our time together. And as you see, our time in this session is going to be split so that we can examine best practices for ELs in both math and ELA. And we're going to see how these 3 guiding principles come to life in both content areas. And then in that process, we'll share some really concrete strategies and resources that you can share with teachers that will support them in doing this really important work. We are going to begin by zooming in on ELA. So this is a 4th grade task from Expeditionary Learning, which is freely available, high quality ELA and literacy instructional materials. And this lesson specifically comes from Module 1, which is called Poetry, Poets, and Becoming Writers. The objective of this specific lesson is to read and summarize Robert Frost's poem, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. And just to give you some framing and some context for the lesson, before this lesson, the instructional materials spend a good amount of time building students' knowledge of poetry. And so now we're going to get right into the text and the task from this lesson. Take a moment now and click on the link that you see in the chat box. And I would like you to do these 3 things. Read the poem, determine what is the big idea, and then reflect on this question. What evidence from the text supports your thinking? We'll take just a couple of minutes to scan. So we'll take about 3 to 5 minutes to scan and think. And I want you to really be thinking about what is the big idea of this poem. So as you've read, the big idea of this poem, or the overall gist as we read it, is that this man is stopping to enjoy a quiet moment of time in nature, even though he's busy and he has a ways to go. So if we're looking at the text, we can see this idea that the man says, he will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. So we know he's stopping in the woods. We see that he has promises to keep and miles to go before he sleeps. So we know that he's busy, but he wanted to take this moment to just sit and enjoy this quiet time. Now, I want us to take a moment and consider what makes this text and task complex. And most importantly, considering our context, what specific barriers might our English learners encounter when reading and summarizing this text to identify the big idea or the gist? So I'd like you to go back to the text, find really specific examples of what makes it complex, what makes the task complex, and where barriers may arise for our English learners. So let's take about 2 minutes to do that and identify those, and then I'll give you your next step. Once you identify what makes this text and task complex and what barriers ELs may encounter, go ahead and chat your reflections, actually to all panelists if you can, not to all panelists and attendees. This is one of those opportunities. You do not need to share a well-written paragraph. That's okay. Think about a few phrases, words, sentences that capture your takeaways. But what I do push for you is to be really specific about where you see the complexity and where you see potential barriers. See some really excellent responses coming through. Michelle says the word arrangement or the syntax, these are, I think, I know. Laura pointed out this phrase, the sweep of the easy wind, which is a figurative way to describe the wind that might confuse students. Specific vocabulary words, Mary says words like downy, like harness, are sentence structures. Also, Michelle points out this idea of the number of pronouns, which could be a real struggle for some of our ELs to match pronouns to the actual nouns that they're identifying. Thank you all so much. These are great responses. And what I want to pull out is that this is obviously a quite complex text and task for our ELs. And at some point, you may even catch yourself wondering, like, is this text too complex for my students, particularly my English learners, or maybe my students who struggle to read complex text? And I want to bring us back to a key idea that was shared on the ELA webinars last week. And that is that all students need to read complex texts. This quote came from the article, "Struggle is not a bad word." The types of texts that teachers use with their students is an issue of equity. Teachers must provide a text diet rich with difficult texts to adolescents, including those who may struggle when reading them, to ensure equitable literacy instruction for all. There is no doubt that the text we just read is complex, especially for fourth graders and especially for English learners. And it can present a number of challenges for any students who read it, in particular our ELs. But the question is not whether or not students should read this text or if they need something easier. Because as research tells us, and as this quote highlights, giving all students access to texts like this is really an issue of equity. So the question instead becomes, how can we support English learners in successfully accessing this text or other texts like it? And so I'm going to bring us back to those three guiding principles. In a moment, we're going to look at a set of examples and non-examples of supports that are either aligned or misaligned to these three principles to help illustrate what they look like in action. But first, I want to take a moment to unpack the first principle just a bit, because while the other two principles feel a bit more specific and concrete, this first principle feels like a much bigger concept. And it really is. What stands out to me is that principles 2 and 3 really could almost be subcategories that fall under the umbrella of the first principle. And this is by design for the purpose of our time together for this session. So scaffolds and supports must be in service of helping ELs access grade level content. Few things to unpack about this. First and foremost, it's the focus on accessing grade level content. This principle is going to assume that ELs are not being pulled out of grade level core instruction in order to receive instruction at a lower level. This has been the theme across all of our webinars so far, and it's just as true for ELs as it is for students with disabilities and other students who may struggle with complex texts. ELs must be receiving on grade level instruction in the gen ed classroom, and when teachers determine that their ELs need additional support for a given text, they must be really intentional about the scaffolds and supports they put in place. In other words, we are not selecting strategies for the sake of strategies. We are thinking really intentionally about what supports are most critical based on the text that we are reading. And as we shared earlier when we first introduced these principles, there are endless examples of strategies. We're going to highlight just a few in the examples we're about to look at. But what's really important, or most important to remember here, is the purpose that the strategies serve. Particularly, what purpose they serve in supporting ELs in accessing and understanding a complex grade level text. So let's examine a set of example and non-example practices to better understand how these three guiding principles come to life in ELA instruction. So we're going to take a couple of moments. If you can click the link that was just shared. I want you to read the example and the non-example. And as you read, think about, what do these examples and non-examples illuminate for you about supporting English learners in ELA? And then also, what questions does this raise for you? As you're reviewing, take note of the questions and then jot your thinking as you go, because you're going to get some time to share these ideas in just a few minutes so that we can kind of surface some of the really important things that you notice. So let's take about 2 minutes to review the examples and non-examples, and then I will ask you to share your responses. I'm going to give us a couple more minutes to think and to jot down our thoughts. But when you are ready, as you finish reading, I would love to hear your thoughts. Again, these don't have to be well-written paragraphs, just a few words, phrases, or sentences that capture your takeaways. But I am going to give us about 1 to 2 more minutes before I even start sharing out your thoughts, so you have sufficient time to think. See a couple of great responses starting to pop in. As you finish reading, please make sure to drop your thoughts into the chat box. I see a number of people have identified this use of visuals paired with language to support connecting to background knowledge, defining vocabulary while providing instructions in that example to get really specific about what you're looking for. Heidi shares that the example ensures a higher rate of engagement because all students are expected to interact with the text, and it's chunked. It's broken down into more manageable parts and encourages a higher level of thinking than the non-example. We also see verbal cues. We see really strong questioning in the example that Karen pulled out. And I think Tracy pulled out the same. I also appreciate that Christy called out that the non-example calls only on volunteers, and often our English learners may take more time to process or may be afraid to use expressive language in a full group setting, so they're much less likely to do that volunteering. And Laura pointed out that we see these sentence frames. And finally, Allison pointed out using the Zoom chat rooms, you can reduce the number of students that that our ELs are talking to really increase the likelihood that they would participate. These are really great responses. And what you've started to do is like parse out the particulars about what effective supports should look like for our English learners. Thank you all so much. And so what this shows is if our effective supports are in service of supporting students in making meaning of the text, and they are intentional based on the unique complexities of the specific text and task that we are reading and completing. They act as an on-ramp for students to access the text, and super important, they don't water down the task or decrease the rigor. And as many of you called out, they really push students to do the heavy lifting. We provide an opportunity for them to talk and discuss. Just like, I'm gonna pause only because Heidi asks the question, could this be provided to newcomer ELs in their native language in advance in order to increase comprehension and involvement in the group discussion? Heidi, that's a great option. I think providing it in advance for them to review prior to using it reading it in English with their classmates and fully engaging, I think is a great plan. And yes, to Rebecca, all materials will be available at the end of the session. So Just like the guiding principles, these key points about supports are relevant whether instruction is happening in person in a traditional classroom setting or in a distance learning environment like the one that students will be engaging in this summer. You're able to use these strategies and these scaffolds either way, which is why they're so useful to think through. And to that kind of end, let's take a moment to revisit where we are in our agenda. And we're going to take a really similar approach to see how these guiding principles now come to life in math instruction. So we're going to kind of follow the same process. We're going to start by examining a task. So to do that, we are in this case looking at a Zern task. It's a 5th grade task, and it actually comes from the small group lessons in mission 5, which is the second to last mission from grade 5. And this one is focused on volume, area, and shapes. For our purposes, we are going to be zooming in on one task from lesson 7. So the objective for this lesson is to solve word problems involving the volume of rectangular prisms with whole number edge lengths. And I think it's really important to highlight the focus on solving word problems because that's often an area of struggle. And it's important to point out that before this lesson, the instructional materials spend time building students' conceptual understanding of volume. And of course, the best way for us to really start to determine what makes this task complex in order to then figure out what supports our ELs need is to do the math ourselves. So let's try that now. Take a moment to just read the task to yourself. And then I want you to grab a piece of scrap paper or a Post-it note, whatever's nearby, to work through the problem yourself. And we will take about 3 minutes to do this now. I'll give you some time to do the math, and then we'll move on. All right, let's quickly debrief this problem. And it's important to note that this is one way a student might go about solving it. There are several ways you could have done it. The problem requires students to work backwards and reason that since Jeffrey needs 36 cubic feet of volume and that the height of Jeffrey's planter is 3 feet, then division shows us that the base of the planter must have an area of 12 square feet. So from there, students have the freedom to design a planter with a base measuring 12 by 1, 6 by 2, or 4 by 3. So multiple options, multiple right answers, which certainly also increases the complexity. Now that we've done the math ourselves, I'd like us to take a moment to step back and analyze the complexity of this task. So you're going to think about 2 things: what makes the task complex, And what specific barriers might our ELs encounter when working with this task? And in just a moment, we're going to use the chat feature again so that you can share out your thoughts. So please make sure you have at least one idea in terms of what makes it complex or what barriers might ELs encounter. So let's take about 30 seconds to think before we chat our reflections to everyone. All right, if you have an idea about what makes this task complex or what specific barriers our ELs might encounter when working with the task, go ahead and drop that into the chat for me. I also appreciate those of you who said it is math. That is a very fair point. And to go from there, I see a lot of us talking about, Karen mentions a lot of the vocabulary that would be difficult to conceptualize, like planter, soil, cubic feet. We have the wording around not taller than, or starts 3 feet off the ground, which has come through for a few people. Heidi mentions the formula and needing to use it in reverse. And Laura talks about, which is a great point, getting hung up on the actual measurement units because perhaps they use a metric system in their home country and some of that language doesn't make sense. And another Laura talks about not knowing what a planter is or not knowing it not aligning to their thinking because of living in an apartment rather than a house. Lots of comments around the metric versus standard conversion, which is something that I have encountered with many of my students. So thank you all so much. These are great points. And the question then becomes, just like last time, how can we support English learners in successfully accessing this task? And we come back to these 3 guiding principles. And just like we did in ELA, we are going to look at a set of examples and non-examples of supports that are either aligned or misaligned to these 3 principles to help illustrate what these principles look like in action in math instruction as compared to ELA. And again, we really want to spend some time unpacking this first principle a bit more now through the lens of math. The spirit of this principle is that ELs are not getting pulled out of their core math instruction to get something else, which almost always means something lower. And this principle highlights the importance of providing ELs the supports they need to access the grade level content, which means adjusting our instruction, not the task itself. And just like in ELA, the focus here is on being really intentional based on the unique needs of this specific task. It's not about picking a random strategy from a long list and then layering it on top of the task, but instead doing the work of analyzing the task and then identifying the potential barriers that students may encounter. Then putting the right support in place to help students navigate those barriers when they arise. So just like in the ELA section, we're going to take some time to examine a set of example and non-example practices to understand how these 3 guiding principles come to life in math instruction. So let's take a couple of minutes now to read the directions. Read the example and the non-example. And take note as you read, what do these examples and non-examples illuminate for you about supporting ELs in math? And what questions does this raise for you? And again, you'll be able to share these in just a few minutes, but let's take a couple of minutes to review this independently first. And I'll let you know when to drop your thoughts into chat. Feel free to take another minute or so to read, but if you are at a point that you're ready to share what this illuminates for you about supporting ELs in math or any questions that arise, go ahead and drop your thoughts into the chat, and I will share out a few of them as they pop in, or as many as I can. And I want to thank Michelle popped in this thought that the examples and non-examples are so useful because we may be doing exactly what the teacher in the non-example is doing with really good intentions. But we don't realize how we could do it differently in a way that doesn't reduce the rigor for our students. And so I so appreciate that kind of surfacing that tension that may exist. Starting to see some great responses popping through. Rebecca points out that the example is really helping us to build independent learners, whereas the non-example is creating dependent learners. And that in that non-example, the teacher is doing most of the thinking and the work. I appreciate too that Amanda calls out that the example focuses on the strategy, which is transferable, not just the specific problem that they are doing in that moment. Stephanie points out that 3-read strategy gives us multiple opportunities to facilitate understanding with our students. And Janny, thank you for pointing out that the non-example, actually the visual is a 2D rectangle, which could actually confuse students further when we're trying to think about cubic with length, width, and height. It's interesting, somebody points out that the non-example groups students by ability in the Zoom room, which is something that we sometimes do as teachers, but keep in mind that if we put all of our lower level English speakers in one space, they're never hearing higher levels of English. And we only improve our language by that idea of input plus 1. So we need to be hearing levels of language that are slightly above our current language proficiency in order to see improvement. So really pushing our students to not be in homogeneous groupings, but rather heterogeneous, really pushes their language abilities. And it's something to consider. It's something that it took me a long time to navigate as a teacher as well, but something to think through very carefully. Thank you all so much for all of these amazing thoughts. These were really exciting to see. And it brings us back to this idea around our effective supports. So once again, our effective supports are in service of supporting students in making meaning of the text. And in this case, we kind of did that by that 3-read strategy. We also think about that they're intentional based on the unique complexities of the text. We think about that they act as an on-ramp for students. So we did not water down the rigor of that math problem, but we provided so many access points that our students would be able to find ways to get to the answer and get to the process of being successful. And finally, as many of you pointed out, the example pushed students to do the heavy lifting of the thinking. The non-example allowed all of that to rest on the shoulders of the teacher. So that's something that we really want to be thinking about. And again, these strategies are completely implementable, whether instruction is happening in person, in a traditional classroom setting, or in a distance learning environment like the one students will be engaging in over the summer. So thank you all so much for that. I do want to point out a couple of additional resources that will be in the folder we're sharing with webinar materials. So there is one that is mathematical language routines from Student Achievement Partners, and it's super practical strategies that can be applied to a variety of lessons and tasks. And one of the example supports we just saw is the 3 reads strategy, and that's an example of a mathematical language routine. You can get more details about that in this guide. Another document, which is, I should have flipped the order there, which is supporting academic language and content in mathematics. It's a mix of research, clear examples, and really concrete strategies. And it provides more context around mathematical language routines. So these are really good tools if you're working with students on math to increase language and support them with that process. And that really brings us to the final step of our agenda, the wrap up. We want to take these last few minutes to close out by sharing some additional resources that you can take back to support educators in doing this work. We want to preview the learning that's coming in the next set of webinars and share a link to the survey so that you can provide some feedback on today's session. And it's important though for this, before we move on, that now that we have a really clear vision of excellence kind of for what it looks like to effectively support ELs in accessing grade level content, I want to take a quick second to step back and consider what that means for leaders. If you are a leader, whether that means school-based or district level, there are a few ways that you can, there are a few really important ways that you can support this work as it's happening too. So you can ensure that your teachers are using high quality grade level instructional materials. That's huge. You can norm with all educators on the importance of grade level instruction for all students. This depends on educators deeply understanding and buying into the research-based approach of giving all students access to grade level content and not lowering the bar for certain groups of students. And as a former school leader and district leader myself, that is incredibly important, and that is mindset work that we must do because that's what our students deserve. We also can ensure all students, including English learners, are receiving Tier 1 instruction every day. It's not enough to have them placed in other locations or removed from Tier 1. We need to make sure as leaders that we create and protect adequate planning time for all teachers and that we foster frequent and ongoing collaboration amongst EL teachers and their gen ed counterparts. And I want to unpack just quickly what this specific statement may look like in various different scenarios. So if we're in a physical school setting, this means very concretely that our master schedule is designed in a way that students are not pulled out of the core ELA or core math block. In a distance learning environment, this could look different depending on the situation. So for instance, let's say teachers are doing synchronous learning for a small summer class. So all students are logging in at the same time to engage in live learning together. Then it's important that the teacher is really focusing that instruction on grade level content for the whole group and that they are providing intentional supports like we saw in today's session to their ELs. Or maybe the teacher is sharing recordings of their lesson paired with independent tasks for students. And what this would look like is ensuring that all students are receiving the same content and that perhaps ELs are getting additional supports. Like perhaps you're providing an audio recording of a particularly challenging text or a glossary, a visual glossary like we saw in the Frost poem to support them in understanding the vocabulary. Or depending on the summer class size, perhaps the teacher is scheduling more individual check-ins with students, which is awesome. They'll be able to provide even more intentional and targeted supports to each of the students. But the point is that the supports that they're providing should be focused on supporting those students and accessing the same grade level content as their peers. ELs should not be given lower level texts and tasks to replace the grade level content that their peers are learning. Does that mean that it isn't okay to give ELs additional texts and tasks that may give them some additional independent practice or some lower level texts to help build their knowledge connected to the complex grade level text? Absolutely not. And we actually really encourage that. And I think that's a question I answered earlier. You can provide home language texts in addition to the grade level texts being used in class. The point is that these things cannot replace the complex grade level text. And the other thing that's super important is that when we're planning for virtual instruction, we need to find creative and simple ways to foster student-to-student conversations. And we know that these are important for all students, but they are especially important for our English learners. So consider using Zoom breakout rooms, phone calls where appropriate, for the low-tech version, because some of our students may not have access to computers. You could also encourage students to use the three-way call structure. Google has the option for Google Voice, and apps like Marco Polo that allow you to record and send video messages can also be really helpful. I'm going to come back to one question that is in the Q&A in just a moment, I promise, because it's a great question. And to close out, before I answer that question, I want you to take just a moment to reflect and synthesize. Based on your specific role, what do you plan to do as a result of today's learning? And if you could pop that into the chat, because I would love to see your takeaways. I'll share some that have come up. And I appreciate Mary's point, I think, to me, which is staff need to make sure that whatever apps you are using are approved by their district, and that is 100% accurate. Certain districts approve certain apps and certain communication tools for students in general, so please only use the ones that are approved of. But take a moment to go ahead and drop your thoughts into the chat. What are you most excited to take away and apply for today's session? See a few of us saying that they're planning to share the webinar, which I greatly appreciate. A number of us talking about taking away the guiding principles and being really intentional in examples and non-examples when there's new or difficult vocabulary. Thinking about how to do multiple readings. I'm so glad that that strategy was useful and appeals. And I love this. Karen points out, rather than make it easier, use strategies in service of the on-grade level tasks, which is so important. And a couple additional resources for us as you finish. Please keep those coming because I love seeing this. We are going to, there are two other resources, I apologize, that we have for you. One of which is from Student Achievement Partners and Achieve the Core, which is a supporting English language learners annotated bibliography, which is incredibly useful. There's also the English Learners Success Forum, which is a collaboration of researchers, teachers, district leaders, and funders who are really passionate around improving instructional materials for ELs. We've also developed a one-pager of strategies that you can consider implementing and including in your work. And before previewing the upcoming webinar content, I just wanted to share the link to today's feedback survey. If you could navigate to this link, tinyurl.com/NDE7survey, and complete it, we would greatly appreciate it. You can do it now, or you can do it later this evening, whenever it's convenient for you. But your feedback is really valuable and helps us ensure that we're providing you useful and timely content. And Corey, I think I am now handing it back off to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Megan. I really appreciate the conversation today, and I can't help but just reiterate across 7 webinars how we've continued to hear access to grade level content and instruction. And I'm just so pleased with how that message is consistent, whether it's when we're talking about English learners or supporting students with disabilities. That is going to be absolutely essential as we move into fall. I previewed this a couple of times on some other webinars. There is going to be some support from Student Achievement Partners around essential content for literacy and mathematics for the next school year. It's not around prioritizing standards next year. I want to just be really clear about that. It is more about the essential content as it relates to what fall might hold. So once that becomes available, I'm going to work through our literacy and mathematics cadre to make sure folks have that and make sure ESUs have that, share that with curriculum directors as well. And then what NDE staff will do is we'll work to customize that for Nebraska. So what does that mean relative to Nebraska standards as well? Along with that, we're still working on specific academic guidance for reentry, which includes content and considerations around assessment and how we really understand where students are at and the supports that are needing to be provided. Also what that means around instruction materials and professional learning. I might just also mention a little plug for districts as they're thinking about, they may have to move to digital delivery. The example from Zern Math, we previewed Zern Math on a previous webinar. Zern is a K-5 all green on EdReports curriculum that is set up for digital delivery. So if your district is thinking that you're going to move to one-to-one or you are one-to-one and you're like, how in the world are we going to deliver our mathematics curriculum digitally? Take a look at Zern. It's open. It's very cost efficient as well. As a reminder too, the webinars are archived. I noticed that Tuesdays are up already, so we'll get this one up as soon as we can as well. And then next week, 2 webinars, one on Tuesday and one on Thursday. Tuesdays is around how we can leverage assessment for individualized instruction. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about science because we don't want to lose science in this space. So how can we support independent science learning through the summer and through the fall as well? More than anything, just want to say thanks for your time today and appreciate all you're doing for our students and our schools and our communities. And if you have any questions or need anything, please let us know. We'll try to get the recording as well as the slides and all of the resources that were linked today up by the end of the day tomorrow. So, and don't forget tomorrow's Friday. So I hope you all have a great weekend and we will see you next week.